Arka is currently serving as associate professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Gandhinagar in India. He's published academic work in several edited volumes like Deleuze and Beckett, Notes, and in journals such as Textual Practice, Interventions, Semi-Beckett Today, Aujourd'hui, Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society, Journal of World Literature, among others. Also, I think in Filozofski Vesnik, at least, and also could be in Problemi, right, as well. Arka is the founding editor of Sanglap, an anthem book series editor for Freudian, Lacanian psychoanalysis and philosophy. He is the author of Beckett, Lacan, and the Mathematical Writing of the Real, and has co-edited Samuel Beckett in the Encounter of Philosophy and Literature in 2013, Samuel Beckett in Extensions of the Mind in 2017, Ecological Entanglements and Understanding Badiou, Understanding Modernism in 2024. The title of his presentation will be Matheme-a-tics and Subjectivity. Please, Arka.
Thank you, Tadej. Hopefully I am audible. First and foremost, thank you for this kind invitation, and I'm happy to resume the continued conversation from last year. I'm very happy to share the same panel with Alejandro. It was a great paper. Thank you, Alejandro. Sort of sets the tone, but also makes it a bit more complicated for me to sort of live up to that. Okay, so this is very much a work in progress, and I'm trying to construct a certain kind of conceptual framework of understanding the relationship between psychoanalysis and mathematics. And all kinds of feedback would be very helpful, and I'm looking forward to that. I'll try and keep it to the time. So when we think about the relationship between mathematics and the psychoanalytic understanding of subjectivity, we are not talking about mathematization of the subject in an instrumentalist sense, in which mathematics would be quantification or reduced to quantification, shall we say. In some sense, it's the excluded subject of mathematics that we are trying to perhaps rethink in psychoanalysis. And this is a subject that is why I wanted to break the signifier mathematics and also note how A, the object A, is inscribed within mathematics as a signifier if we spell it like this. And one could potentially argue the way Lacan would differentiate his use of linguistics by calling it linguistere or linguistics. What we have in Lacan is more of a matheme-a-tics, where of course we have the matheme or the mathematical understanding of the letter as a kind of integral transmission, and hence that sort of almost rousing slogan in Seminar 20, mathematization as our goal, as our aim, and mathematical formalization, I mean, as our goal and aim in psychoanalysis, but also the way the object plays a role in this idea of the matheme and its relation to not just the subject, but also the other is something that I hope to explore here. And perhaps not to make it too silly, at the same time, I was thinking about the word tick and how the subject ticks. So there's a way in which that breakage of the signifier gives us something to work with. I mean, to put it simply, I'm kind of speculating whether the relationship or the lack thereof between the one and the other, the subject and the other, could be seen mathematically. And there are different ideas of non-relation that might emerge. Non-relation as cut, but also non-relation as a kind of distance, as we shall see from the two parts of this paper. So without further ado, let me just get into the first part of the paper, where I'm primarily talking about Seminar 9, the seminar on identification, and Lacan's use of mathematical ideas in that seminar. It's also curiously the only seminar in the more or less, shall we say, earlier phase of the seminars before the first. It's at least within the first 10 seminars that Lacan uses at least a rudimentary idea of the knot. It's still, of course, not the Borromean knot, but it's interesting and fascinating for me think that perhaps in some sense the Seminar 9 utilization of not sets the tone for something that comes much later, the Borromean not in Seminar 20. So in Seminar 9 on identification, one of the ways in which Lacan approaches the problem of identification is mathematical, and it concerns the idea of self-sameness in the equation A is equal to A. And looking at the first session, perhaps where he introduces this idea, is the session of 15/11/1961. And he takes his departures from Russell and Wittgenstein on the point about equivalence of A with itself, and ultimately calls this A is A nothing but difference that emerges as key to identification for Lacan, as he highlights Saussure's stress on the signifier's difference as the element that allows us to isolate and identify it as such. The signifier constitutes itself in the pure difference of the one. The A is A for Lacan signifies nothing, but this nothing makes a meaning. This point about nothing appears in the session on 6th December 1961. So Lacan calls this A is A, this idea of equation, a belief, and argues otherwise. And I quote, it is in the very status of A that there is inscribed that A cannot be A, unquote. His wrestle with this idea of equivalence and alignment with difference on the other side of equivalence anticipates, I would argue, the idea of mathematical self-sameness of the letter in the integral transmission of the matheme. In this paper, we'll see how Lacan's position on this question of equivalence, whether or not it changes at some level from this relatively earlier seminar to the later seminars, and we'll come to that point. So if language becomes mathematically self-identical, how can psychoanalytic interpretation operate? Because psychoanalytic interpretation is premised on equivocation, whereas a certain mathematical notion of language would be completely univocal or equivalent. So it's this tension between equivalence and equivocation that I'm trying to explore here. So that way, isn't mathematization an ironic goal and ideal for psychoanalysis? And this is where I think one would have to perhaps emphasize that for Lacan, mathematical formalization is a formalization of the real, and it will always produce an impasse. This is not a mathematization of the subject without impasses. In fact, mathematics becomes a way of understanding or trying to understand, in some sense, the subject in the real as a cut, as a discontinuity. And in this sense, perhaps the entire clinical process of psychoanalysis that exhausts the symbolic order, that exhausts the symbolic imaginary rapport of meaning production, the very process of psychoanalysis is perhaps mathematical in this minimalist slant of how it's taking away from meaning to sort of make us arrive on this letter, the letter that transmits integrally, which is ironically a sort of dead end for psychoanalytic interpretation. But this dead end is precisely what is aimed for. Now, in the identification seminar, Lacan keeps returning to the problem of the one as it inflects the subject's relationship with the signifier, and his references are quite distinctly mathematical. For example, just to give one example, he invokes Euclid's elements to problematize the concept of the unit, monas, which he relates to the unary trait, which is one of the sort of central discussion points around the idea of the one in this seminar. And this might change in Seminar 19, but there is still a relation between unary trait and the one that Lacan would, at least at some level, preserve. So, the monas is related to unary trait as a particular mode of identification in group psychology. In fact, let me offer Lacan's translation of the Euclid sentence, which is formulated like this: number, for its part, is nothing other than this sort of multiplicity which arises precisely from the introduction of units. So this idea of the one laying the foundation for one multiple or multiplicity as such is something that he comes back to throughout this particular seminar. In fact, set theory is also invoked as an interplay of letters. Wouldn't necessarily go into that, but to stick to that idea of the letter A and A is equal to A and how that's an absurd formulation. Uh, if the letter A is charged to represent all other letters of the alphabet, we arrive at this contradiction. And I'm quoting Lacan from the session of, sorry, the session of January 10th, 1962. And this is how it goes. If we begin from the fact that A, this is our starting point as regards identification, fundamentally is not at all A, there is no difficulty here. The letter A inside the parenthesis in which there are oriented all the letters that it has symbolically subsumed is not the same A and is at the same time the same. So there's a sort of contradiction of the A not being A and the A being A. This is another way for Lacan to show that the A is not A, at least not in a univocal sense, explaining Russell's paradox that the set of all sets does not contain itself. Lacan stresses the one's non-containment of itself. So the one does not contain itself as the pure mark of difference. The one is not united, nor is it equivalent. The one of the set of all sets is pure difference. It is this difference of the single or unary trait that produces the plus one in the signifying chain of language. But Lacan, as sort of repeatedly reminds us in the seminar, that plus one, the plus sign, does not mean addition. It's not an addition. It's more like an accumulation without addition. Uh, and this is the one of repetition, the one of repetition that is a pure mark of difference. I mean, here, of course, we could remember Lacan's, little story that he tells us about what he saw in the museum and the notches on the museum object that he calls the primitive hunter's notches, and each notch is a one. We don't know whether at this point the hunter knows how to count, but each notch is a one, and it is a one because of the pure difference that it has from each other. And even if the notches are not identical, visually speaking, they're still, in that sense, the one of repetition that is differentially repeated across the series. Now, if we look at this particular tale that he tells us, this is the Museum Saint Germain, where he encounters this art object, so to speak, and what he calls the Magdalenian rib bone with the notches on it. Now, if we look at these notches, and this is not a point that he discusses at any length while talking about this art object, I'm interested in the distance between one notch and another. And it is because of this distance that they are differentially positioned as the pure mark of difference of the one. It's the distance that calls for difference here. So if we think about the category of distance here in relation to the non-relation of pure difference, where the one accumulates as pure difference across the series of notches, that might be one way of looking at the idea of the mathematical one that underlines the subject's relationship with the other, or the one's relationship with the other, if you like. This is a distance, but not necessarily a cut. It's difficult to say that the spatial difference between one notch and another is a cut. So it's perhaps not exactly a cut, but it is still a distance. And this distance is crucial because if the notches were all superimposed onto each other without any spatial difference, they wouldn't have been able to mark this pure one of difference that repeats itself. And that's the first point I wanted to make about the way he talks about the subject coming into being through this tale of the primitive hunter. The other point about this particular seminar, if we look at seminar 9, is the way it talks about number and number in relation to metonymy, the metonymy of desire, where number is a quality of the object of castration. If we look at this particular citation, and this is from 20th, 26, 1962, Lacan writes, Lacan speaks or perhaps writes in the double edge of the written seminar, and I quote, it is rather probable that the object as it is constituted at the level of desire, namely the object in function, not of privation, but of castration, is the only object that can really be numerical. So the only numerical object is the object of castration. I'm not sure that this suffices to affirm that it is enumerable, but when I say that it is numerical, I mean that it carries number with it as a quality. So this idea that the object of castration carries number in it as a quality, I think is a telling remark. And right at the end of the seminar, he makes a sort of comparison between number or quantity, as he calls it, as the object of mathematical science. And he uses the word science for psychoanalysis here, at least at this moment, within this moment of his teaching, that if quantity or number is the object of science, the science of mathematics, this object of castration is our object, the object of psychoanalytic science understood in that particular way. So one wonders whether object of castration introduces number. The other way of looking at it would be the subject's split introduces number, because as we know, for Lacan, the subject is represented by one signifier to another. And in this substitutive operation, the subject is both effaced and constructed. There's a certain aphanesis of the subject, as the Lacan of Seminar 11 will call it. The process of the subject formed in the signifying chain, I would say, is through this sort of double cut, which is already mathematical. So instead of course, the dominant Lacanian emphasis on talking about matheme as the order of integral transmission, I'm trying to sort of contrast it or juxtapose it with this more sort of, let's say, splitting function of the matheme, where the matheme splits. But what does it produce through the split is the question. What kind of object does it produce through the split? One last point, at least in this part of the paper, to sort of try and look at whether Lacan's take on equivalence changes in the Borromean clinic. In one sense it does, but perhaps in another sense it doesn't. So what does the equivalence of the RSI mean for him? In Seminar 23, this idea of equivalence is directly associated with the non-relation of the three registers, at least at a one-on-one level. And I mean, this is just to quote that formulation, when there is equivalence, there is no relation, from Seminar 23. What creates non-equivalence, however, in this structure is precisely the fourth ring of the Santom. Santom breaks the equivalence of RSI as an equivalent structure of three rings, and it creates or forges a relation insofar as it breaks this equivalence. And I'm quoting Lacan here. At the level of the Santom, there is not, therefore, any equivalence to the relation. I mean, he's talking about the green and the red here. We can't really go into the question of color, perhaps, but we could come back to it if there is a question at the end. So the point is, and let me quote from here, to the extent that there is a Santom, there is no sexual equivalence. That is to say, there is relation. Indeed, if no relation stems from equivalence, then relation is structured to the extent that there is no equivalence. Therefore, there is both sexual relation and no relation. We arrive at another kind of antinomy, an antinomy of the real. Where there is relation, it is to the extent that there is Santom. That is to say, to the extent that the other sex is supported by the Santom. So again, we see that the tension between equivalence and non-equivalence in terms of non-relation for equivalence and relation, or at least a fourfold forged relation through the centum, a supportive relation through the centum, where there is no equivalence. This tension still remains in Seminar 23. If we step back a little bit and look at another way in which this idea of the problem of mathematical equivalence perhaps comes in Seminar 22, the seminar titled RSI, there's a moment where Lacan is trying to define the symptom through the mathematical idea of function, f bracket x, function of x. And let me read this passage. What is it to say the symptom? It is the function of the symptom, a function to be understood as the mathematical formulation. What is this x, the x, or what is the function of x? And if we see the symptom as a function of x, what is this x? And Lacan writes, I quote again, this is what can be expressed of the unconscious by a letter, insofar as that only in the letter is the identity of self to self isolated from every quality. So again, this is where the letter becomes mathematical, not just because it's a function. I mean, if we look at the famous text from Ecri, the instance of the letter in the unconscious, which at least in its first iteration appeared in 1957, there's already that idea of the letter as a localized structure of the signifier. One could argue the letter becomes more like a mathematized body of the signifier in alignment with Lalonde. And here, the function of symptom that Lacan is talking about involves this X, which is an isolation. And this is a mathematical process of isolation, the way I was talking about the entire process of psychoanalysis as a kind of mathematical extraction, as it were, from equivocation towards a tentative idea of equivalence, at least. But can equivalence entirely upstage equivocation? That I think remains an open question. But I think there is an attempt, at least, to settle the score of meaning. And mathematics comes in precisely in that settlement of meaning through a sort of equivalence that can be aimed at, but produced only through equivocation. So this letter is the identity of self to self. Again, we have a certain idea of self-sameness of the letter or the integral transmission of the letter, but it is isolated from every quality. And I would argue this process of isolating the letter from the signifier, from the signifying operation of language, is the process of psychoanalysis in some sense. So to
Excuse
see
me,
the
Arka.
symptom,
Hello. Hello.
yeah,
Can I just, I will intervene
sure.
with a voice. So, because this is the only way that you will see me. So, can you just like quick, I mean, in let's say 2 minutes more because we're short on time. Yeah. Thank you.
To see the symptom, I'll conclude with this point, and let me not go into the other part of the paper that I think is going to, of course, overshoot us. I'm sorry about not being true to time. So, to see the symptom as a mathematical function is to see it almost like a univocal letter that can be isolated from the unconscious and written as a one. This one letter is, in some sense, self-same, as we saw with the passage, and unary. But here, the act of interpretation is to mathematically isolate from speech the symptomatic function of this unary letter. Interpretation will have to work through equivocation, but in some sense, it aims to establish equivalence, equivalence from equivocation. And as late as Seminar 25, I'll end with this last point, we still have this equivalence versus equivocation, as it were, as a kind of dialectical tension all the way in Seminar 25. And I'll just read one particular passage with that I'll end. He's talking about the idea of bi-univocal correspondence or bijection as a certain idea of equivalence. A set is only, and I'm quoting Lacan, a set is only numerable starting from the moment when it is demonstrated that it is bi-univocal, but precisely in analysis, it is equivocation that dominates. So again, it is this particular tension between the idea of correspondence, equivalence on the one hand, and equivocation that dominates the very process of analysis, but perhaps to aim at an equivocation, sorry, an equivalence. I'm slipping on the two signifiers now. But I think that's the point. Let me end with that, that interpretation is a sort of working through the equivocal status of language, aiming to establish an equivalence. But does that equivalence entirely cancel equivocation? Sort of remains a question. And let me end with that question. Thank you. Sorry if I overshot the time.
Thank you. Yeah, because we're short on time, let's just allow perhaps one or maybe two questions if there are any. Peter, do you have a question? Okay, thank you.
Hello, Arka. I'm using this opportunity to say hi. Well, listening to you, I don't want to burden you with my own problems, but tomorrow I will speak about surprise. And my lecture somehow coincides with what you're trying to do. So because you started the first lecture of the 9th seminar was about A is A, etc. So in a way, there's a problem because for logics, for Wittgenstein in Tractatus, logic doesn't know any surprises. On the other hand, the work of the unconscious is working with constant surprises. So formations of the unconscious is this. So this relation between univocal and equivocal somehow has to take into the account the formation of the unconscious, so the Freudian slips, etc., etc. So, but my question concerns the start of your talk. You were speaking about exclusion of the subject in mathematics. Do you think that this exclusion of the subject is similar as exclusion of the subject is in science? This is the very big question, because on one hand, you have psychoanalysis, which is science, but a very special science, wants to be a science, etc., etc. Here I'm relying on Jean-Claude Milner's In Search for Clarity. And his way of thinking it is somehow via coup de dé, which is in English throwing of dice, you know? And he somehow works, you know, in mathematics you have iron laws. When you figure out something, there are iron laws. But the mathematics as a field is open to new discoveries. So you have to think this paradox. And in psychoanalysis, it's similar in a way. So in relation to mathematics, psychoanalysis, and science, you have to think this, which is comprised in the problem of univocal and equivocal, etc. So for me, sorry, yeah. This is actually an intervention question, whatever, you know.
Question, but a very difficult question for me to answer straight away. I'll have to think about it, but I would agree that when I mentioned the exclusion of the subject from mathematics, I think that is quite similar to the way science perhaps does not want to think about its own subjectivity, which might simply mean sometimes the scientist as a subject, the scientist as a subject who has created a scientific truth. There is this sort of scientific claim to universality, which often goes beyond the subject. In terms of the dialectics of equivocation and equivalence, what I was kind of trying to hint at, but didn't get the time to elaborate, was this idea that the relation or non-relation between the subject and the other. There's another part of this paper which I presented in a slightly truncated way again in the LAC conference, where through Seminar 16, I'm looking at the way Lacan is talking about this problem of one extra that is generated in the relationship, or when one tries to think about some kind of a relational matrix uh, between the one and the other. So that if the unconscious is and this is the way Lacan would define the unconscious in the position of the unconscious, right? That it is the cut between the subject and the other. Now, in this cut, we could think of a particular way in which the unconscious itself is formed by this mathematical process of cutting. And this is not something that I know at this point, but this is where I'm trying to go with this project, to see whether this cut, or how, or what kind of relation does this cut have with this integral transmissibility of mathematical formalization that Lacan emphasizes, but never without this caution, by the way, even in Seminar 20, that after all, this does not mean mathematics is a meta-language. For him, that distinction between meta-language and object language simply does not hold. And that entanglement, I think, is again related to the entanglement of the one and the other, where there is no other of the other, because the other of the other is subsumed within the field of the other. And this is one of the problems of this one extra that he discusses in Seminar 16. Yeah, but that's not exactly an answer to your question, but I'll have to think. I've made a note of the question. Logic does not know surprise. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Arka. I think we will give you another applause, and then we will return in 15 minutes for the last part of this day. Thank you.